For generations, the Bible has been presented as a singular, unbroken transmission, a direct line of communication from the divine, handed down exactly as it was written. This perception of an unadulterated text remains the foundation for billions of people in homes and churches across the world. In 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer digging for fertilizer struck a sealed earthenware jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts that had remained unread and buried in the desert for over 1,600 years. These jars held a diverse collection of Gospels and apocalyptic visions that described a highly mystical Christianity. In these pages, the divine was located within ordinary human experience and consciousness, rather than behind the walls of an institution. These early communities preserved hundreds of competing writings, from the Gospel of Thomas to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Some portrayed Jesus as a human teacher of enlightenment. Others rejected the wrathful deity of the Old Testament entirely. This extreme theological fluidity stands in stark contrast to the rigid, uniform structure of the modern Bible. This transition from a decentralized spiritual movement to a uniform global religion was the result of a documented 1,700-year-old imperial edict. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine recognized that a fractured Christianity was a political liability for an empire strained by civil war and economic pressure. He approached the faith as an instrument of unity, needing a uniform doctrine to harness a population that was rapidly fragmenting. In 325 CE, Constantine summoned bishops from every province to the city of Nicaea, personally funding their travel to establish a single orthodox position. He presided over the council, pressuring the attendees toward theological choices that would produce maximum doctrinal stability across his territories. Once a single narrative was sanctioned by the emperor, all alternative texts were reclassified as heresy. Accounts that promoted personal enlightenment or gave spiritual authority to women were marked for destruction, as they complicated the state's preferred institutional narrative. Enforcement was immediate and absolute. Holding a theological text outside the authorized canon became a capital offense. Bishops tracked and burned unauthorized writings, and entire communities were broken apart for protecting the same texts they had considered sacred a century earlier. Nicaea established the precedent for ecclesiastical governance, a singular authorized story flowing through a channel the state could monitor and control. In 382 CE, the drive for uniformity reached its next stage when Pope Damasus commissioned the scholar Jerome to produce a single Latin translation known as the Vulgate. This text would become the official Bible of the Roman Church for over 1,000 years. Jerome's translation made specific linguistic choices that favored institutional power. He rendered the Greek word ekklesia, meaning a loose gathering or assembly of people, as church, a word that carried the weight of a structured, hierarchical institution with fixed authority. The Greek word metanoia, which described an internal change of mind or a shift in consciousness, became penance. What began as an interior transformation was translated into a formal sacramental act that required the mediation of a priest. Finally, the term presbyter, meaning an elder, was translated as priest. This choice imported a whole apparatus of sacred hierarchy borrowed from pagan ritual, effectively placing the clergy in a position of power over the ordinary believer. Passage by passage, these translation choices mandated clerical mediation for every encounter with the divine, ensuring that salvation flowed through the institution. During the 16th century Reformation, figures like Tyndale and Luther challenged the Church's monopoly by translating Scripture into common languages so that ordinary people could read the text for themselves. However, these reformers remained within the curated catalog of books selected at Nicaea. They changed who was permitted to read the text, but they did not change which books were included in the Bible, leaving the original Roman framework intact. The 1611 King James Bible descends directly from Jerome's ancient Latin Vulgate. Its structure, omissions, and framing are rooted in the decisions made by emperors and bishops over 1,000 years before the first English printing. When the Protestants broke from the authority of Rome, they unknowingly carried the Roman Empire's engineered rulebook with them into the modern world. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the Church occupied the resulting administrative void. It used the legitimacy of its curated text to inherit Rome's land titles, taxation networks, and legal codes, effectively continuing imperial governance in ecclesiastical robes. This institutional authority provided the framework for global expansion centuries later. Missionaries carried these specific, curated texts as the advanced guard of a colonizing apparatus, using the language of salvation to establish cultural, legal, and economic dominion over indigenous populations across 3 continents. The reach of the institution extended into the private thoughts of its subjects through the sacrament of confession. By training people from childhood to report their thoughts and desires to a priest, the Church created a population that managed its own behavior through the fear of sin. By controlling the narrative of the divine, the institution learned to manage millions of people through the internal pressure of manufactured guilt. The discovery of the buried Nag Hammadi texts proves that the Bible as we have it is an incomplete archive. These documents were not excluded because they were false, but because they were dangerous to an institution that required obedience over individual enlightenment. These marginalized voices only survived because early believers chose to bury them in the desert rather than surrender their spiritual independence to the Roman state. Rome silenced these voices because they offered a version of the story that the empire could not govern. Now that the desert has returned them, we have to decide if we are willing to read what